This thing, do you think the BBC, it's Douglas Adams, who I like his writing, but he generally kept out of politics, but one description he made was about the BBC has a very schizophrenic time of it, because in a lot of the other media, the job of the television company is to sell audiences to advertisers, but the BBC, that's not exactly what they're doing. They've got a different job, so they have a schizophrenic time of things because they're in a completely different business to all their competitors. What do you think about that?
But it's true to some extent, but it's not. I mean, I think the problem is that it's not entirely true. If they were insulated from commercial pressures, where they didn't have to compete on audiences, then it would be much easier for them to make proper investigative journalism, and much easier for them to report the news better, because they'd be insulated against one of the key pressures. They wouldn't be insulated against flack and spin and the supply of information, but they would be insulated against market pressures to compete with market-oriented broadcasters like ITV and Sky, in fact. So that's a key element of the difficulty, is that they have to compete for audiences with commercial broadcasters, who only exist in order to exchange advertising revenue for eyeballs. And so you have the raced out market and the commercialisation of broadcast output, so that you no longer have current affairs programmes, proper current affairs programmes. That much of the documentary production on television is now taken up with reality type shows. These are called educational or current affairs or documentary programmes. Actually just nonsense mostly, although not all reality shows are just nonsense. So you have that commercialising process, and of course that's what Murdoch is trying to do. He's trying to beat the BBC in order that it can be broken up and privatised. That's the agenda and the aim.
Well, there was a speech last week, wasn't there, at the festival? It was Murdoch's son.
Yeah. Well, it was naked, wasn't it? I mean, it was an embarrassment. I mean, you'd almost think that they would want someone who appeared not to be connected with Murdoch to say the kind of nonsense that he was saying about the BBC being a chilling influence in the broadcasting scene. You know. And
that's when Blair flies out to see Murdoch just before the sun changes the day before, and they're
sure. Well, I mean, on the contrary, it's the Murdoch press, the Murdoch empire, which is the biggest threat to broadcasting freedom, which is not interested either in journalism and in reporting the powerful, or just in making money. I mean, the bizarre thing about Murdoch is that he is, ferociously right-wing as well, and so he actually has a kind of moralist agenda, and is not just interested in making money, and supports. It makes sure that his papers all over the world reflect his ideology, but in addition to reflecting the pursuit of profit as a kind of the preeminent goal of humanity. So all of his papers were in favour of the Iraq War, and there's a very strong editorial line that comes directly from the top, which does indicate that to understand the press and the media, you need to understand economic interests, but also to understand the way in which those are thought about and presented and fought for by the people who own the press, and their political views and their sense of what the media are for, so that they're used not just to pursue profits, but also to pursue particular ideological ends.
So with the BBC's funding, then, it's different. They're pursuing different ideological ends because they're controlled more by the government. It's not quite as commercial, but it is, government is a way for the government to keep control over the country. I think in the BBC you get a lot of they have all the pageantry, all the government pageantry, Trooping the Colour, the Parliament and everything, and it's, I've always thought it's about, keeping the myth of a unified nation, this part of the job of the BBC. I mean, where do you see it with that? We're all in this together, that kind of thing. That's part of their remit, I've always felt.
That tends to be the way, and I think that's got progressive elements to it as well as the post-imperial nonsense of the Trooping of the Colour. But it's not that the BBC is controlled by government through its different regulatory arrangements. I mean, I think it's on the contrary that the fact that it's paid for by the licence fee is a means of insulating it from government pressure. so that if the money was raised directly from the government and given by DCMS, by the Cultural Ministry, then it would be more controlled. So I think
who determines what level the licence fee is?
The government determines that, and that's of course a key lever for the government then to pressure the broadcasters. But if you were thinking about how you'd have a democratic broadcasting system, then you'd have to think about a way to insulate the broadcasting system from both corporate and state pressures. If we move towards a system where the state becomes democratised, that would be less of an issue, but nevertheless you'd have to have some kind of insulation. And the best way of insulating it is to have, independent funding, presided over by some kind of directly elected body, as opposed to the current position. So I think in any political system, if you actually want independent media, then the only way of doing that is to find a mechanism which provides the most independence for the media system, because you can't have media systems operating outside of a regulatory format without any means of generating income outside of the market. There isn't a way of doing that. So you have to find a way which protects the independence and insulates the independence as best as possible. And having a direct subvention from every person in the country is quite a good way of doing that. Albeit, when the government corrupts it and tries to influence it, that kind of thing.
Okay. And another just slightly different topic. What about the BBC on the internet? Because most of the people you speak to, if they're sitting at work all day, they have BBC News, BBC Sport, and they just, along with their email, they just leave that running all day. I mean, so many people you speak to. So the BBC is actually quite dominant for a lot of things on the internet. People use Facebook a lot as well and things like that, but BBC News particularly is very dominant on the internet. What do you think about that?
How do you mean, what do I think about it?
Well, it's being funded by British taxpayers, to an extent. I mean, what do you feel about that? Do you think that's fair, or where should the money be coming from for doing that? Like, I read the thing with the Guardian Media Group, who complain that any new market the BBC enters into, it dominates immediately. And they're very upset about that.
Well, all they're concerned about is that the BBC is not a proper market player. So that what they want, the implication of that is that the BBC should be privatised, which is not a good idea. But I think the question about what the BBC should do, I think that the BBC should be a public service broadcaster, which is there to serve the public and to inform the public. I mean, the most basic democratic theory, including that of J.S. Mill and people like that, assumes that people have got something approaching perfect information about how the system operates in order that they can make democratic preferences. Now, even if you want a kind of Millsian sort of democracy, which I'm not sure I do, but the basics of it has to be that there's free and open and fair information available so people can make up their minds about the world. Now, you can't provide that any other way than by public service, because otherwise the market will dominate. And so the BBC should concentrate on that as its core effort. I mean, actually, there shouldn't be any reason really to expect that anyone else would do that in any sensible way. So I think the BBC should be limited to public service work. That would mean including the internet. It's nothing wrong with having an internet site. That's absolutely fine. But it should be public funded, and it should be independent of government.
Okay. The thing is about the BBC I find quite strange is it's not really a question, but they actually do make in other areas like the wildlife programs and things, because of they have this public service element, they can make far better programs than anyone else.
Yeah.
Things like David Attenborough programs and this kind of stuff, and a lot of the comedies are actually considerably better than the things you find on other channels. But since I travel around a bit, and every time I come back, it just seems BBC News content is worse than it was before. Maybe, I don't know, people are getting wiser to it. I mean, there's a thing about, people don't trust something like Fox News very much, but they always kind of trusted the BBC more. Do you think that's been eroded with Iraq and different things? Because the BBC had less anti-war voices than any other channel at that time.
Well, the BBC's own evidence shows that people are less trusting of broadcast news than they were. So that's true.
Has that affected the BBC as much as other broadcasters, or less or more?
I don't know, but I wouldn't say there's any difference really. I mean, people, at the margins, people know that Channel 4 News is better. That there's a wide range of voices on Channel 4 News, that they're a little bit more dispassionate, but they still cheerlead for war. And the Newsnight, you get a bit more, it's kind of it's assumed that it's only the middle class is watching, so they can tell them a bit more about how the society's run. But I mean, you don't get proper news in the sense of, it's two senses, isn't there? On the one hand, a proper range of views about how the world operates, and on the other hand, proper investigations about how the world is. So there's a problem there that they become influenced by propaganda, by lies, because they go for the lowest common denominator, saying the government says this and someone else says that, and they don't bother to find out if it's true. So they could, even if they knew it was true, the way in which they operate make it very difficult for them to say that the government is claiming that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but the BBC has established that they're not. They just couldn't do that because of the way they operate. So I think there's a real problem there, which becomes a problem when more and more people see that they engage in or are susceptible to propaganda campaigns. And that the way in which the internet intersects with that is important, because of course the internet speeds up the political process in the sense that it's now much easier to find out who's lying and why and when, so for example, when they in Vietnam or in the Falklands or in Grenada, in the invasion of Grenada in 1984, it took a long time to work out just how we'd been lied to, or how the Gulf of Tonkin incident had been fabricated to escalate war in Vietnam, how Belgrano was sailing away from the exclusion zone, how the deaths and massacres that happened in Grenada weren't as the Americans first said. So, but on Iraq, for example, in 2002, 2003, it was quite quick that much of the lies were discovered. Like the dodgy dossier, which was discovered to have been plagiarized from a thesis, was discovered by an academic surfing the web in Cambridge, and that's quite different to how news cycles used to operate. So it's becoming the case that people get more and more of their news off the internet. It's only still a small proportion of people, but that it's becoming the case that people are leaving mainstream news, leaving buying the papers, readerships, and sales of papers are going down. And so the people are shifting to the internet, and that has some positive consequences, it seems to me, in terms of some of this crowdsourcing stuff, and some of the stuff about being able to find out more quickly and to undermine propaganda. But of course, it also means that lies and propaganda can be spread more effectively in some ways.